The rusted gate of Blackwood Ranch creaked open for the first time in 30 years, releasing the ghosts of a life Margaret and Harold thought they'd buried forever. Tumbleweeds rolled across the cracked earth where cattle once grazed, and the old farmhouse stood like a skeleton against the Texas sky, its windows dark and accusing. They'd fled this place in 1993 after the tragedy that shattered their world, swearing never to return. But now, with Harold's cancer diagnosis and nowhere left to run, they had no choice. Rex, their German shepherd, bounded ahead with the enthusiasm only dogs possess, sniffing at memories trapped in the soil. Margaret clutched Harold's weathered hand as they approached the house, both pretending they couldn't hear the whispers of their past echoing through the abandoned rooms. But when Rex began digging frantically behind the old barn, his excited barking turned into something else entirely, something that made Margaret's blood run cold. What Rex unearthed that day wasn't just bones and forgotten treasures, it was proof that some secrets refused to stay buried, and that the real reason they'd fled Blackwood Ranch 30 years ago was about to claw its way back into their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's grip tightened on Harold's arm as Rex's barking grew more frantic. The dog had found something near the old water pump, where sunflowers used to grow in wild abundance. Now only dried stalks remained, twisted and brittle like arthritic fingers reaching toward an unforgiving sky. "Maybe we should call him back," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept across the empty pastures. The sound carried memories she'd tried to forget. Laughter from family barbecues, the gentle lowing of cattle, and underneath it all, the echoes of that terrible night when everything changed. Harold's cancer had aged him beyond his 72 years, but his eyes still held the same stubborn determination that had first attracted her in college. "We can't keep running, Maggie. Not anymore." His voice was hoarse from the treatments, each word a visible effort. "Whatever's out there, we face it together." They'd spent 3 decades building a new life in suburban Dallas, convincing themselves they could forget Blackwood Ranch existed. Harold had sold insurance while Margaret taught elementary school, and they'd grown comfortable in their small brick house with its manicured lawn and predictable neighbors. They'd never spoken about the ranch to anyone, not to friends, not to their daughter Sarah who lived in California, not even to each other except in the darkest hours of sleepless nights. But the medical bills were mounting, and their insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment Harold needed. The ranch, despite its ghosts, was their only remaining asset of any value. They'd come back to assess what could be salvaged, to see if the land might attract a developer or if the mineral rights might be worth something to the fracking companies that had transformed so much of rural Texas. Rex's barking suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as they approached the spot where their dog stood motionless, his tail rigid, his head cocked at an angle that suggested he was listening to something they couldn't hear. "Rex?" Harold called softly. "What is it, boy?" The German shepherd looked back at them, his dark eyes unusually bright, almost human in their intensity. Then he began to dig again, his powerful paws sending clouds of red dirt flying behind him. The soil was looser here than Margaret remembered, as if it had been disturbed more recently than 30 years ago. Harold pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight, the weak beam revealing what Rex had uncovered. It wasn't what Margaret had expected, no old bones or rusted farm equipment. Instead, the dog had found the corner of what looked like a metal box, its surface green with oxidation but still intact. "Harold," Margaret breathed, recognition dawning like a cold sunrise. "That's not supposed to be there." He knelt beside Rex, ignoring the protest from his arthritic joints, and brushed more dirt away from the object. It was definitely a box. Steel, about the size of a briefcase, with a combination lock that had somehow survived decades underground. "Someone's been here," Harold said quietly. "Since we left. Someone buried this after..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither of them could speak aloud about that night, about what had driven them from their home in such desperate haste. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out her own phone. No signal, of course. They were 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by empty rangeland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Whatever was in that box, whatever secrets it contained, they would have to face alone. Rex whined softly and nudged the metal container with his nose, as if urging them to open it. But Margaret found herself stepping backward, every instinct screaming that some doors should never be opened, some truths never revealed. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn and setting the rusted windmill to creaking. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and promising. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch as Margaret stood with her coffee, watching Harold wrestle with the rusted gate that led to what used to be their vegetable garden. 30 years of neglect had transformed their once pristine ranch into something barely recognizable, a skeleton of their former life wrapped in wild mesquite and memories. "Damn thing won't budge," Harold muttered, his weathered hands straining against the corroded latch. At 72, he was still strong, but the Texas heat was already making him sweat through his flannel shirt. Margaret smiled despite herself. Some things never changed. Harold had always been stubborn about fixing things himself, even when they'd had money for hired help. Back when oil prices were high and their mineral rights had made them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. "Maybe we should focus on the house first," she called out, though her voice carried the same weariness that had settled into her bones during the drive from Dallas. Coming back here felt like stepping into a photograph, everything frozen in time, yet somehow completely different. Kaiser, their 3-year-old German shepherd, had no such reservations about their return. The dog bounded through the tall grass with the enthusiasm of youth, his black and tan coat gleaming as he investigated every corner of his new territory. They'd adopted him after Harold's heart attack, when the doctor insisted they needed something to keep them active. Neither had mentioned that Kaiser reminded them of Rex, the shepherd they left behind when they abandoned the ranch in 1993. "At least someone's happy to be here," Margaret said, watching Kaiser disappear behind the old barn. The ranch house itself stood like a monument to their past prosperity. 2 stories of limestone and cedar that Harold had built with his own hands during their early years. Back then, they'd believed this place would be their forever home, where they'd raise children and grow old together. The children never came, and they'd grown old in a Dallas suburb instead, selling insurance and trying to forget the dreams buried in this Texas soil. Margaret's phone buzzed. Another call from their real estate agent, probably wondering when they'd be ready to list the property. The message was the same as yesterday's. Developers were circling like vultures, eager to transform their 847 acres into strip malls or subdivisions. The money would be substantial, enough to secure their retirement and maybe take that trip to Ireland they'd been postponing for decades. "We don't have to decide today," Harold had reminded her during the drive, but they both knew the property taxes were eating into their savings. Sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. A sharp bark echoed from somewhere behind the barn. Then another. Kaiser's barks carried an urgency that made Margaret set down her coffee and step off the porch. "Harold, you hear that?" He straightened from his battle with the gate, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Probably found an armadillo den. City dog doesn't know what to make of country critters." But the barking continued, insistent and strange. Margaret had owned enough dogs to recognize the difference between excitement and alarm. This was something else entirely, a focused intensity that raised the hair on her arms. They found Kaiser behind the barn, near the old oak tree where they used to hang a tire swing. The massive tree had grown larger in their absence, its canopy now shadowing a wide circle of earth that Margaret remembered as bare dirt, worn smooth by years of swinging and playing. Kaiser wasn't barking at the tree, though. He was focused on the ground at its base, pawing at the earth with single-minded determination. His claws scraped against something that wasn't soil, something that made a different sound, hollow and metallic. "What's got into him?" Harold asked, but his voice had changed. Margaret recognized the tone from their early days together, when unexpected problems with the wells or equipment demanded immediate attention. She knelt beside Kaiser, running her hands through the loose soil he'd displaced. Her fingers touched something smooth and artificial, definitely not a root or rock. "There's something buried here." "Probably just an old bucket or some scrap metal," Harold said, but he was already walking back toward the barn. "I'll get a shovel." Margaret remained kneeling, her hands still exploring the buried object. It felt substantial, deliberately placed rather than casually discarded. Kaiser whined softly and licked her face, as if seeking approval for his discovery. The ranch held so many memories, both beautiful and painful. They'd buried their dreams here, along with Rex and a dozen barn cats and the hope of children who never came. But this felt different, foreign, and somehow urgent, like a secret that had been waiting 30 years for someone to return and uncover it. When Harold came back with the shovel, Margaret was still kneeling by the oak tree, staring at the disturbed earth as if it might reveal its secrets through patience alone. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "it wasn't here when we left." The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Margaret still clutched the ceramic mug like an anchor. Through the kitchen window, she watched Harold pacing the backyard where Rex had made his grisly discovery. The hole they'd hastily covered with a blue tarp fluttered in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender. "We should call the police," a voice echoed in the empty kitchen, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to herself or to Harold, who couldn't hear her through the glass. Rex lay sprawled on the linoleum beside her chair, his massive head resting on his paws, brown eyes tracking her every movement. Even the dog seemed to understand the gravity of what they'd unearthed. Margaret reached down to stroke his fur, finding comfort in the familiar gesture that had sustained her through countless difficult moments over the past decade. The back door creaked open, and Harold stepped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor she'd scrubbed clean just yesterday. His face had aged 10 years overnight, deep lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd arrived at the ranch 3 days ago. "The tarp will hold for now," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Bought us some time to think." "Time to think?" Margaret set down her mug with more force than necessary. "Harold, there are human remains in our backyard. This isn't something we think about. It's something we report." He pulled out the chair across from her, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "And tell them what exactly? That our dog dug up bones that have been buried for God knows how long? That we have no idea who they belong to or how they got there? Because we don't know, do we?" She searched his face for any flicker of recognition, any hint that the discovery wasn't as shocking to him as it had been to her. What she found instead was something worse: uncertainty. Harold ran his hands through his thinning grey hair. "I keep trying to remember if there was ever anything strange about this place. Before we left, I mean. But Margaret, I was so focused on the business, on trying to save what we'd built." He trailed off, staring out the window at the tarp. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 3 decades spent away from this place. Margaret found herself cataloguing the gaps in her memory, the details that time had eroded. She remembered the desperation of those final months, the creditors calling, the sleepless nights spent poring over financial statements that never added up to hope. She remembered packing their few remaining possessions while Rex, then just a puppy, chased dust motes in the afternoon light, streaming through these same windows. But what had they missed in their haste to escape? What had been happening on the edges of their crumbling world while they fought to keep their heads above water? "Do you remember the Hendersons?" Harold asked suddenly. "Our neighbors to the west?" Vaguely. "Why?" "Tom Henderson came by that last week, while you were in town dealing with the bank. Said he'd been hearing strange sounds at night, coming from our direction. Thought maybe we had coyotes denning somewhere on the property." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You never mentioned that." "We had bigger problems then. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe the pump house acting up again." Harold's voice grew quieter. But what if it wasn't? Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the front of the house. A moment later, Margaret heard the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. They exchanged glances. They weren't expecting anyone, and the ranch sat at the end of a dead-end road that saw little traffic. Harold stood and moved to the front window, peering through the dusty curtains. "Sheriff's deputy," he announced, his voice tight with tension. Margaret's heart began to race. "Did you call them?" "No. Did you?" The engine noise died, replaced by the sound of a car door slamming. Rex was on his feet now, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Margaret had never seen the dog react this way to law enforcement. He was typically friendly with everyone. "Stay calm," Harold murmured, though his own hands were shaking as he straightened his shirt. "Maybe it's routine. Maybe they're just checking on properties out this way." But Margaret knew better. In her 63 years, she'd learned that coincidences were usually anything but. A sheriff's deputy didn't drive 10 miles down a dirt road to make social calls, especially not the morning after they'd discovered human remains. The knock, when it came, was firm and authoritative. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the old house like gunshots. Harold looked back at her one more time, and in his eyes she saw the same question that was burning in her own mind. How much did they really know about the life they'd built here all those years ago, and how much had they forgotten or chosen not to see? The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold examine the hole Rex had dug. Her husband moved with deliberate caution, his weathered hands holding what looked like fragments of old fabric. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities about what lay buried in their backyard. The logical part of her insisted it was probably nothing, old ranch debris, maybe clothes from previous owners. But the knot in her stomach suggested otherwise. Rex bounded up to Harold, tail wagging, clearly proud of his archaeological efforts. The dog had been restless all night, whining and pacing between the back door and their bedroom. Margaret had attributed it to excitement about being in a new place, but now she wondered if Rex had sensed something they couldn't. Harold looked up toward the house and beckoned her outside. Margaret grabbed her coffee mug and stepped onto the back porch, the wooden boards creaking under her feet. The sound triggered a memory. She and her sister Sarah running across these same boards 30 years ago, racing to see who could reach the tire swing first. "What did you find?" she called out, walking across the overgrown grass. Harold held up several pieces of what appeared to be denim, faded and partially decomposed. "Clothes," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "But there's more." Margaret peered into the hole, which was now about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Rex had been thorough in his excavation. At the bottom, she could make out what looked like leather, a boot, maybe, or a wallet. "Should we call someone?" she asked, though she wasn't sure who. "The local sheriff?" The previous owners had died years ago, according to the real estate agent. "Let's see what else is down there first," Harold said, reaching for the small shovel he'd retrieved from the barn. "Might be nothing worth troubling anyone about." As he carefully scraped away more dirt, Margaret found herself studying the surrounding area with new eyes. The mesquite tree where Rex had made his discovery was old, probably 50 years or more. Its roots had grown around whatever was buried, creating a natural marker that had somehow called to their dog. "Maggie, look at this." Harold's voice was strained. He'd unearthed what was definitely a boot, a cowboy boot. Size looked to be around 10 or 11. The leather was dark with age and moisture, but the stitching was still visible. It was clearly vintage, probably from the 1970s or early 1980s, based on the style. "That's not that unusual," Margaret said, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. "Ranch hands lose things, bury trash. Could have been here for decades." Harold continued digging, working around the boot with archaeological precision. Margaret noticed his hands were shaking slightly, not from age or effort, but from something else. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "Harold, what is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," He paused, sitting back on his heels. "This boot, I think I know it." "What do you mean you know it?" "The stitching pattern, the tooling on the leather, it's distinctive." He pointed to a decorative design barely visible on the boot shaft. "Mexican-made custom work. I've only seen one pair like this." Margaret felt the coffee mug slip from her hands. It hit the ground with a dull thud, the remaining liquid spreading across the dry earth. "Whose boot is it, Harold?" Before he could answer, Rex began barking frantically, his attention focused on something beyond the hole. Margaret turned to see a pickup truck pulling up their long driveway, dust billowing behind it. The truck was white, with official markings she couldn't quite make out from this distance. "Are you expecting anyone?" Harold asked, quickly standing and positioning himself between Margaret and the hole. "No." Margaret squinted at the approaching vehicle. "Looks official." The truck came to a stop near their house, and a man in uniform stepped out. He was tall and lean, wearing a sheriff's badge that glinted in the morning sunlight. Rex's barking intensified, and the dog moved protectively closer to Margaret. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson?" the sheriff called out, walking toward them with measured steps. "I'm Sheriff Coleman. Sorry to bother you folks this early, but I got a call from one of your neighbors. They reported seeing someone digging around back here." Margaret felt her mouth go dry. They'd been so isolated she hadn't even realized they had neighbors close enough to see their property. "Just doing some gardening," Harold replied, his voice steady but his body language betraying his nervousness. Sheriff Coleman's eyes moved from Harold's face to the shovel in his hands, then to the obvious excavation site behind them. His expression shifted from casual neighborliness to professional interest. "Mind if I take a look at what you're planting?" the sheriff asked, though it wasn't really a question. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold examine the hole Rex had dug. Her husband moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent 40 years analyzing evidence, his weathered hands turning the metal fragment over in the light. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. She poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs they'd found in the cupboard, survivors from their old life. The familiar ritual felt strange in this ghost of a kitchen, where cabinet doors hung askew and decades of dust had settled into every crevice. Outside, Rex paced the yard with restless energy, nose to the ground, following scent trails only he could detect. "Find anything else?" Margaret asked, stepping onto the porch with the steaming mugs. Harold accepted the coffee gratefully, but his attention remained fixed on the yard. "Whatever's down there, it's been there a long time. The metal's oxidized, but not completely corroded. I'd guess 25, maybe 30 years. The timeline made Margaret's stomach clench. 30 years ago, they'd been planning their departure from the ranch, their marriage strained to breaking point by Harold's increasingly dangerous work as a federal prosecutor. The threats had been escalating. Late-night phone calls, strangers photographing their property, the dead cat left on their doorstep with a note warning Harold to drop the Castellano case. "You think it could be related to—" "I don't know what to think yet." Harold's voice carried the measured tone he'd always used when a case was developing, when the pieces hadn't yet formed a complete picture. But Rex isn't acting randomly. He's trained to find things that don't belong. As if summoned by his name, the German shepherd appeared at the porch steps, tail wagging but eyes alert. In his mouth, he carried something small and dark. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the unmistakable shape. "Harold!" Her voice was barely a whisper. The bullet was tarnished but intact, its brass casing dented but clearly visible. Harold took it from Rex with the reverence of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. He rolled it between his fingers, examining the caliber, the weight, the particular way the metal had aged. 9mm. His voice was grim. Professional grade. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not literally, but in the way reality sometimes rearranges itself around a terrible new truth. "There's someone buried out there, isn't there?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He was studying the yard with fresh eyes, noting the slight depression Rex had been investigating, the way the grass grew differently in that particular spot, the subtle signs that spoke of earth once disturbed and carefully replaced. "We need to call the sheriff," Margaret said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was when it came to their past. "And tell him what? That our dog dug up evidence of what might be a 30-year-old murder on property we abandoned without explanation?" Harold shook his head. "We need to know what we're dealing with first." Rex whined softly, a sound that raised the hair on Margaret's arms. The dog was staring at the tree line beyond the house, his body rigid with attention. For a moment, neither of them moved, listening to the morning silence that suddenly felt heavy with possibility. "Someone's watching us," Harold said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where he'd once carried a service weapon. Old habits, dormant for decades, were awakening with unsettling ease. Margaret followed his gaze, but saw only shadows between the trees. Still, Rex's behavior was unmistakable, the same alert posture he'd maintained during those final months at the ranch, when every stranger could be a threat. "We should leave," she whispered. "Pack up and go back to Denver. Pretend we never came here." "You know we can't do that." Harold's jaw was set in the stubborn line she remembered too well. "Not now. Whatever happened here, whoever's buried in our yard, it's connected to us somehow. People don't just randomly bury bodies on isolated ranch property." The implication hung between them like a physical presence. The Castellano trial had ended with convictions, but it had also ended with promises of revenge, with threats that had driven them from their home and their dreams. They'd thought time and distance had neutralized those old dangers. They'd been wrong. Rex suddenly bolted toward the trees, barking with an intensity that sent birds exploding from their roosts. Margaret grabbed Harold's arm as her husband started to follow, but the dog stopped at the fence line, hackles raised, staring into the forest depths. Whatever, or whoever, had been watching was gone. But the message was clear. They weren't alone on the ranch anymore, and their buried past was clawing its way back to the surface with every shovelful of earth Rex disturbed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold pace the perimeter of the excavation site. He'd been out there since dawn, circling the hole like a man possessed, occasionally stopping to stare down into the earth that had yielded its secret. Kaiser lay nearby, chin resting on his paws, brown eyes tracking Harold's movements with the patience only dogs possessed. The German shepherd had barely left the site since yesterday's discovery, as if guarding something precious or dangerous. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured coffee into Harold's favorite mug, the one with the faded ranch logo from their early days. Everything felt different now, contaminated by questions that had no easy answers. The skeleton in their backyard had transformed their homecoming from nostalgic to nightmarish. She carried the coffee outside, her bare feet registering the familiar crunch of dried grass and gravel. Harold didn't acknowledge her approach until she pressed the warm mug into his weathered hands. "You need to eat something," she said softly. "Can't." His voice was hoarse from a sleepless night. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those bones. Margaret, what if—" "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't say it." But the unspoken possibility hung between them like smoke. They both knew who had access to this land 30 years ago. They both remembered the circumstances of their departure, the haste with which they'd packed their lives into boxes and fled to the city. Harold's brother, Danny. Margaret had never liked Danny Whitmore. Where Harold was steady and reliable, Danny had been wild, unpredictable, prone to disappearing for weeks only to return with unexplained injuries and pockets full of cash. He'd lived in the old foreman's cabin at the edge of their property, supposedly helping with ranch operations, but Margaret had rarely seen him do an honest day's work. "We need to call the sheriff," Harold said, breaking her reverie. "I know." But neither of them moved toward the house, toward the phone that would bring strangers trampling through their memories. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Margaret's attention. A vehicle approaching fast, too fast for a casual visitor. Her stomach clenched as a white pickup truck materialized from the heat shimmer, bouncing over the rutted drive with reckless abandon. "Expecting anyone?" Harold asked, shielding his eyes against the sun. Margaret shook her head, but something about the truck's aggressive approach triggered a memory. She'd seen driving like that before, years ago, when Danny would come roaring up to the house at all hours, usually drunk or high or both. The truck skidded to a stop near the house, sending up a cloud of dust that made them both cough. The driver's door slammed, and a man emerged, tall, lean, with iron-grey hair and skin weathered to leather. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Well, well," the man called out, striding toward them with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. Heard the Whitmores were back in town. Danny, older, harder, but unmistakably Danny. Harold stepped protectively in front of Margaret, and she felt Kaiser tense beside her, a low rumble building in his chest. "Danny." Harold's greeting was carefully neutral. "Been a long time." 30 years, give or take." Danny's smile didn't reach his eyes as he surveyed the ranch. His gaze lingered on the excavation site, and Margaret saw something flicker across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Heard you folks were doing some digging. Improving the property?" The casual question felt anything but casual. Margaret studied her former brother-in-law, noting the expensive boots, the custom belt buckle, the gold watch glinting on his wrist. Whatever Danny had been doing for 3 decades, it had paid well. "Just fixing some drainage issues," Harold lied smoothly. Danny nodded slowly, but his attention remained fixed on the hole in the ground. "Funny thing about old ranches, never know what you might find buried out there. Previous owners sometimes left all sorts of debris." The word hung in the air like a threat. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "You'd know about that, wouldn't you?" she found herself saying. Both men turned to look at her, and she lifted her chin defiantly. "About what gets buried on ranch land?" Danny's smile widened, revealing teeth too white to be natural. "Margaret, sweet as ever. You always did have an active imagination." Kaiser's rumble deepened, and the dog rose slowly to his feet, hackles beginning to rise. Margaret had never seen the normally gentle animal react to anyone with such obvious distrust. "Well," Danny said, backing toward his truck with exaggerated casualness, "just wanted to welcome you folks home. Hope you enjoy your stay. And Harold?" He paused with his hand on the truck door. "If you find anything interesting while you're digging around, you might want to think real careful about what you do with it. Some things are better left buried." The truck roared to life, and Danny was gone as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving only dust and the lingering scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of fear. The metal box sat on their kitchen table like an accusation, its rusted surface gleaming dully under the overhead light. Margaret had tried to clean off the worst of the dirt, but 30 years underground had left its mark. Harold paced behind her, his boots clicking against the linoleum with each agitated step. "We should call someone," he muttered for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "The police, maybe. Or a lawyer." Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the box's lid. "And tell them what? That our dog dug up something that might contain evidence of a crime we're not even sure happened? Margaret, there are bones out there." She turned to face him, seeing her own fear reflected in his weathered features. "We don't know what those bones are. Could be cattle, could be human." Harold's voice dropped barely above a whisper. "You saw them too? That looked like part of a rib cage." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of Rex scratching at the back door. Margaret had locked him outside after he'd tried to return to the burial site twice more, his instincts driving him towards something they weren't ready to face. 32 years, Margaret said finally. "We left this place 32 years ago, Harold. Whatever's in this ground, whatever's in this box, it was here before we came back. It was here the whole time we were gone, and the world kept turning." Harold stopped pacing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we need to know what we're dealing with before we bring anyone else into this." Her hands moved to the simple latch mechanism. "Whatever's in here, it's been waiting all this time. A few more minutes won't change anything." The latch was corroded, but functional. Margaret applied pressure slowly, feeling the mechanism resist before finally giving way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the kitchen. Harold moved closer, his shadow falling across the table as Margaret lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but now resembled more of a dark, organic shroud, lay several objects. Margaret carefully peeled back the deteriorated fabric, revealing a collection that made her breath catch in her throat. A leather wallet, its brown surface cracked but still intact. A woman's ring, the small diamond still catching the light. A set of car keys attached to a rabbit's foot keychain. And beneath it all, a manila envelope sealed with tape that had somehow survived the decades underground. Harold reached for the wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. When he opened it, a driver's license was visible through the plastic window. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and kind eyes. Margaret leaned closer to read the name. "James Mitchell," she read aloud. "Born 1952. She calculated quickly. He would have been 26 when this was issued. Harold flipped through the wallet's contents. $23 in bills that looked pristine despite their age. A business card for Mitchell Construction. A folded photograph of the same young man with his arm around a pretty blonde woman who was showing off an engagement ring to the camera. Margaret picked up the ring from the box, comparing it to the one in the photograph. It was the same, a simple gold band with a modest solitaire diamond. Her hands trembled as she set it down. "Harold," she whispered. "I remember them." He looked up sharply from the wallet. "What?" "The summer before we left. There was a young couple looking at the Hendricks place down the road. They came by here asking about the area, about whether it was a good place to start a family." Margaret's voice grew stronger as the memory solidified. "His name was Jim. He said he was in construction, wanted to build houses. She was pregnant, I think, just barely showing." Harold's face had gone pale. The Hendricks place sold that summer, but they never moved in. The sale fell through, remember? The buyers just disappeared. Margaret reached for the manila envelope, her hands no longer steady. The tape peeled away easily, and she tipped the contents onto the table. More photographs spilled out, along with what appeared to be a birth certificate and several documents she couldn't immediately identify. One photograph made her gasp. It showed the young woman, no longer pregnant, holding a baby. On the back, someone had written, "Sarah and baby Michael, September 1978, in fading blue ink." "They had a baby," Margaret breathed. "Harold, they had a baby, and then they just vanished." Harold was studying one of the documents. "This is a property deed," he said slowly, "for the Hendricks place, signed by James and Sarah Mitchell." He looked up at Margaret, his eyes wide with understanding. "They did buy it. The sale didn't fall through. They bought it, and then something happened to them before they could tell anyone." Margaret stared at the photographs scattered across the table, at the faces of two young people who had been planning a future that was cut short somewhere on their land. Rex's scratching at the door grew more insistent, as if he could sense they were finally beginning to understand what he had found. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold pace the front porch like a caged animal. He'd been up since 4, unable to sleep after their discovery in the cellar. The metal box sat on their kitchen table now, its contents spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Margaret picked up the birth certificate again, studying the faded ink. "Baby girl Morrison, born March 15, 1962, no first name listed." The same year she and Harold had left the ranch, broken-hearted and childless after years of trying to start a family. The same year Harold's father had grown increasingly distant and strange. "We need to call the sheriff," Harold said, stepping inside and letting the screen door slam behind him. "And tell him what? That we found some old papers in our cellar?" Margaret set down the certificate. "Harold, think about this. If we involve the law now, before we understand what we're dealing with, we could be opening a can of worms we can't close." Harold slumped into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "But Margaret, what if there's more than papers down there? What if Kaiser found what he did because—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. They were both thinking the same dark thoughts, the same terrible possibilities that had kept them awake through the night. Kaiser whined from his position by the back door, nose pressed to the glass. He'd been restless all morning, wanting to return to the cellar. Margaret watched him pace, his behavior so different from his usual calm demeanor. "The letters," she said suddenly. "We haven't read all the letters." Harold reached for the small bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. His hands shook slightly as he untied it, revealing a dozen or more handwritten notes. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The first letter was dated June 1962, 3 months after the birth certificate. Harold read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest one, I know what we did was wrong, but I can't stop thinking about her sweet face. She deserved better than what we gave her. I pray someday we'll find the courage to make this right." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "Who wrote that?" Harold turned the letter over, looking for a signature, but found only initials M. "M," Margaret repeated. "Could that be—" "Eleanor Morrison," Harold finished. "My mother." They stared at each other across the table, the implications settling over them like a heavy blanket. Harold's mother had died when he was 16, 2 years before he and Margaret met. His father had always described her as a saint, a woman who'd wanted nothing more than children, but had only been blessed with Harold. "But that doesn't make sense," Margaret said. "Your parents only had you. Your father told us—" "My father told us a lot of things," Harold interrupted, his voice bitter. "Doesn't mean they were true." He picked up the next letter, dated August 1962. "James won't speak of it anymore. Says it's done and we must forget. But how can I forget? How can I pretend she never existed? The guilt is eating me alive. I see her face in every child that passes by town." Margaret reached across and took Harold's hand. "There was another child, a daughter. A daughter my parents gave away," Harold said, his voice hollow. "A daughter they pretended never existed." Kaiser's whining grew more insistent, and Margaret looked over to see him pawing at the door. Something about his urgency made her stomach clench. "Harold, what if the birth certificate and letters aren't the real secret Kaiser found? What if they're just markers?" Harold looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Why would your parents bury important papers in the cellar? Why not keep them in a safe or a bank? Unless—" She paused, not wanting to voice her suspicions. "Unless they were marking something else," Harold finished quietly. They sat in silence, both understanding what needed to happen next, but neither wanting to be the first to say it. Finally, Harold stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll get the shovels." 20 minutes later they stood at the edge of the cellar, Kaiser dancing excitedly around their feet. Margaret had brought a flashlight, and Harold carried 2 spades they'd found in the old barn. The morning air felt thick and oppressive, storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Maybe we should wait," Margaret said, though she knew they couldn't. Not now, not with so many questions burning between them. Harold was already climbing down into the cellar. 30 years we've been away from this place, Margaret. 30 years wondering why my father changed, why he pushed us to leave, why he never wanted us to come back. I think it's time we found out." Margaret followed him down, Kaiser bounding ahead of them both, leading them back to the spot where their old life ended, and something much darker began. The morning air carried a chill that hadn't been there the day before, as if the earth itself was recoiling from what lay beneath. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold pace the backyard with Max, both of them drawn repeatedly to the spot where the metal box had emerged from its 3-decade grave. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of what they'd found. The documents in that box weren't just family records, they were evidence of something far more sinister, birth certificates for children she'd never heard of, medical records that made her stomach turn, and correspondence between Harold's father and men whose names she recognized from old newspaper headlines about missing persons. "We should call the police," she said when Harold finally came inside, his boots muddy and his face pale. "With what story?" Harold set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "That my dead father might have been involved in something horrible 30 years ago. That we found mysterious documents on our own property that could implicate us." "Us? Harold, we weren't even living here then. We were in California, remember? You were finishing your residency. You think that matters? You think they'll care about alibis when they see what's in those papers?" Margaret pulled the box closer across the kitchen table. In daylight, the contents looked even more damning. There were photographs too, Polaroids of children she didn't recognize, all roughly the same age, all with that hollow look of fear that made her chest tighten. On the back of each photo, someone had written dates and what looked like code numbers. "Look at this," she whispered, holding up a letter dated March 1993. The letterhead belonged to a clinic that had been shut down in the mid-90s amid scandal. "Your father was corresponding with Dr. Brennan about procurement and placement services. Harold, what if—" "Don't." His voice was sharp enough to cut. "Don't say it out loud." But the words hung between them anyway, unspoken but undeniably present. Child trafficking, the ranch as a way station, Harold's father as something far worse than the stern, distant man Harold remembered. Max whined at the back door, pawing at the glass. When Harold let him out, the dog immediately trotted to a spot about 20 feet from where they'd found the first box and began digging again. "Jesus Christ," Harold muttered, grabbing a shovel. "There's more." This time they worked together, Margaret's hands blistering as she helped scrape away decades of compressed earth. Max's nose had led them true again. Within an hour, they'd uncovered 2 more metal containers, both smaller than the first, but equally weathered. The second box contained money, stacks of hundreds still wrapped in bank bands, though the bills were old enough that some of the faces looked unfamiliar. Margaret counted quickly. At least $50,000, maybe more. "Payment," Harold said quietly. This was payment for services rendered. The third box made Margaret wish they'd never come back to Texas at all. More photographs, but these were different. Security cameras still showing vehicles, license plates and faces, including Harold's father standing next to a van with several children visible in the background. The timestamps showed dates spanning from 1989 to 1995. "We have to call someone," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those children, their families deserve to know what happened." Harold was staring at one particular photograph. In it, his father stood beside a woman Margaret didn't recognize, both of them watching as a man in a suit led a small girl toward a black sedan. "I remember her," Harold said suddenly. "The woman. She worked for the county social services. She came to the house sometimes when I was in high school, but Dad always sent me away when she visited." His hands were shaking as he set the photo down. "Her name was Janet something. She always brought paperwork." Margaret felt pieces clicking together in her mind, forming a picture she desperately didn't want to see clearly. "Paperwork? For what?" "Foster placements, I thought. Dad said he was helping find homes for troubled kids." Harold's laugh was bitter. "I actually admired him for it. Thought he was doing something good." The implications crashed over them both. Not foster care, something much worse. Children disappearing into a network that stretched from county offices to isolated ranches to God knows where else. "We can't just sit on this," Margaret said. "Whatever the consequences are for us, those families—" "What families?" Harold's voice cracked. "Look at these kids, Margaret. Really look at them. These aren't children who were reported missing from loving homes. These are throwaways, kids the system lost track of, kids nobody looked for." The cruelty of that truth settled over them like dust. They'd uncovered evidence of something monstrous, but justice for the victims seemed as buried as the boxes themselves. Still, Margaret knew they couldn't walk away. Some discoveries demanded action, no matter the cost. Outside, Max had started digging again. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Margaret carried it to the kitchen table. Harold followed behind her, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a chair. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light that slanted through grimy windows. 34 years, Harold whispered, staring at the folder as if it might burst into flames. We've been living a lie for 34 years. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents that painted a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see clearly. Birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records, all bearing the name Elena Rodriguez, all dated just weeks before they'd fled this place in 1989. She was so young, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. 17. Just 17 years old. The pregnancy test they'd found in the buried box suddenly made terrible sense. Elena Rodriguez had been one of the migrant workers who'd lived in the small quarters behind the main ranch buildings. Margaret remembered her, a quiet girl with dark eyes and calloused hands who'd worked harder than anyone else, despite being barely more than a child herself. Harold leaned forward, pressing his palms against his temples. I keep trying to remember. That last summer, before we left, there was something your father wasn't telling us. Margaret pulled out a handwritten letter. The ink faded, but still legible. Elena's careful script told a story of fear and desperation. She was pregnant, alone, and terrified of being deported. She'd begged Margaret's father, Thomas Lawson, for help. Listen to this, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as she read. Mr. Lawson promised he would take care of everything. He said the baby would have a good life, that I shouldn't worry. But I am worried. I don't know where he plans to take my child. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. The word him hit Harold like a physical blow. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Him, he repeated. Margaret, when did we start the adoption process for Danny? Margaret's hands began to tremble. September 1989, right after we moved to Austin. Dad said he'd heard about a baby through some contacts, that we could skip most of the waiting period because of special circumstances. Outside, they could hear Rex moving around the yard, occasionally barking at shadows. The loyal dog had started this avalanche when he dug up that metal box 2 days ago. Now Margaret wondered if they'd ever be able to stop it from destroying everything in its path. Harold stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the old worker quarters. The small buildings were falling apart now, roofs sagging and walls weathered grey, but he could picture them, as they'd been 3 decades ago, filled with families who'd worked the ranch seasonally. Elena lived in the blue cottage, he said suddenly. I remember now. She used to tend your mother's garden when she got sick. Your dad, he took an interest in her situation. Margaret joined him at the window, following his gaze. What kind of interest? I thought it was charity. Elena was alone, no family that anyone knew of. When she started showing, some of the other workers said she wouldn't talk about the father. Your dad made sure she had extra food, easier work assignments. A new document at the bottom of the folder caught Margaret's attention. It was a medical report from a private clinic in Houston, dated August 15, 1989. Elena Rodriguez had given birth to a healthy baby boy at 3:17 a.m. The father was listed as unknown, but stapled to the back was a handwritten note that made Margaret's blood run cold. Harold, she whispered, look at this. The note was in her father's handwriting. Payment completed as agreed. ER to be transported to Mexican border immediately following delivery. Child to be placed with MNH as discussed. All documentation to be destroyed except what's necessary for legal adoption. No further contact. Harold sank into a chair, the weight of understanding crushing down on him. He bought our son. Your father bought Danny from that girl and then made sure she disappeared. Margaret's mind raced through memories of Danny's childhood, looking for signs they'd missed. His dark hair that looked nothing like theirs, his natural ability with Spanish that had impressed his teachers, the way he'd always asked questions about his birth parents that they'd deflected with practiced ease. She didn't give him up willingly, Margaret said, her voice hollow. This wasn't an adoption. This was theft. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the kitchen. Somewhere in the walls, the house settled with a groan that sounded almost human. Margaret looked at the documents spread across the table and realized they weren't just pieces of paper. They were evidence of a crime that had shaped their entire family. And Danny, their beloved son, had been stolen from a teenage girl who'd trusted the wrong man to help her. The leather journal felt heavier in Margaret's hands than its actual weight suggested, each page loaded with secrets that seemed to pulse against her fingertips. She sat at the kitchen table while Harold paced behind her, his boots creating a rhythmic soundtrack to her growing dread. Outside, Zeus lay sprawled on the porch, occasionally lifting his head to scan the horizon as if sensing the tension that had settled over the ranch like morning fog. June 15th, 1987, Margaret read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas came by again today. He's getting desperate. Says the investors from Dallas are asking too many questions about the mineral rights. I told him what I've told him before. Those documents don't exist anymore. Harold stopped pacing. What documents? Margaret flipped back several pages, searching for context. The journal entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, written in her father-in-law's careful script. Here, she said, finding an earlier entry. March 3rd, 1987. H doesn't know about the original survey. Better that way. What he doesn't know can't hurt the family when this all comes to light. The oil company boys think they're clever, but they don't know about the mineral rights clause in the Brennan deed. If they did, they'd realize they've been drilling on land they don't own. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Harold's face had gone pale, and he gripped the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles showed white against the wood. Brennan, he said finally. That was Thomas's last name. Thomas Brennan. He used to come around when I was a kid, always talking business with my father. I thought he was just another rancher. Margaret continued reading, each entry revealing another piece of a puzzle that painted Harold's father in an increasingly unflattering light. The journal detailed years of deception, forged documents, bribed officials, and a systematic effort to hide the true ownership of mineral rights that belonged to families throughout the county. Listen to this one, Margaret said, her voice growing steadier with anger. September 1st, 1987. H asked about the new truck today. Had to tell him I sold some cattle, but the truth is the oil money keeps coming. 23 families think they lost their mineral rights in the county consolidation, but those rights are still valid, still mine. The beauty of bureaucratic confusion. Nobody questions paperwork that looks official. Harold sank into the chair across from her. My college tuition, the ranch improvements, the new equipment. He looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. It was all built on stolen money. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. His skin felt cold, and she could feel a slight tremor in his fingers. Outside, Zeus rose suddenly and trotted to the edge of the porch, his ears alert. A moment later, they heard the distant sound of a car engine. Someone's coming, Harold said, moving to the window. Through the dusty glass, they could see a black sedan making its way up the dirt road, trailing a plume of dust in the afternoon sun. Margaret quickly closed the journal and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Should we hide the box? Too late for that, Harold replied, watching the sedan pull up beside their rental car. Besides, if someone knows we're here, they'd probably already know what we found. The car sat for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, before both front doors opened simultaneously. Two men emerged, one tall and lean, wearing an expensive-looking suit despite the rural setting, the other shorter and stockier, his eyes constantly moving as he surveyed their surroundings. Zeus stood at attention, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The taller man approached the porch with confident strides, his companion hanging back near the car. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, he called out, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Margaret couldn't place. My name is Vincent Caldwell. I represent certain parties with an interest in your family's property. Harold opened the front door but didn't invite them in. What kind of interest? Caldwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The kind that's been patient for 30 years, but is running out of time. I believe you've recently made some discoveries that belonged to my clients originally. We're here to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The journal seemed to burn against her ribs where it rested in her jacket pocket. Zeus's growl grew louder, and she noticed his hackles beginning to rise. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Harold said carefully. "We're just here to settle my father's estate, clean out some old belongings." Caldwell's smile widened, becoming predatory. "Mr. Patterson, we both know that's not entirely true. Your dog has quite the talent for excavation, doesn't he? The question now is whether we handle this like civilized people or if things need to become more complicated." The shorter man shifted his position, and Margaret caught the brief glimpse of something metallic beneath his jacket. Her mouth went dry as she realized they were no longer dealing with family secrets and old guilt. They were in immediate danger. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Rex patrol the fence line with unusual intensity. The dog hadn't been the same since yesterday's discovery. None of them had. Harold sat hunched over the kitchen table, the yellow documents spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture they didn't want to see. "Listen to this," Harold said, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night. He held up a letter dated 32 years ago. "It's from the bank president to someone named Vincent Caruso. The Morrison Ranch will be available as discussed. Ensure the family relocates before the 15th. Margaret turned from the window, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Vincent Caruso. I remember that name from the newspaper clippings we found. Wasn't he the oil executive who died in that car accident the year we left?" Harold's finger traced the letterhead. "But according to this correspondence, he was very much alive when we were forced to sell." The implications hung heavy between them. Margaret sank into the chair across from Harold, her mind racing back to those final weeks on the ranch. The sudden pressure from the bank, the impossible deadlines, the way everyone in town had seemed to avoid their eyes. She'd attributed it to shame, people uncomfortable with their neighbor's misfortune. Now she wondered if it had been guilt instead. "There's more," Harold continued, pulling out a thick manila envelope. Bank statements, transfer records, property assessments. He spread them out methodically. "Margaret, they didn't just force us out, they orchestrated the whole thing. The drought was real, but these documents show they could have extended our loan. They chose not to." Rex's sharp bark drew their attention outside. The German shepherd stood rigid near the old barn, his hackles raised, staring at something beyond their view. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "We need to call someone," she said. "The police, the FBI, someone who can make sense of this." Harold shook his head slowly. "With what proof? These documents were buried in our own backyard. Any halfway decent lawyer would claim we planted them ourselves. Besides, most of the people involved are probably dead by now." "Not all of them." Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the documents the night before. "Look at this signature on the transfer papers. J. Whitman, Deputy County Clerk. Janet Whitman still works at the courthouse. I saw her name on the website when we were researching the property records." Harold leaned forward, studying the signature. "You think she'd talk?" Before Margaret could answer, Rex's barking intensified. Through the window, they saw a dust cloud approaching on the main road. A black SUV with tinted windows moved slowly along their property line, as if the driver was taking inventory of everything they could see. "That's the third car this morning," Harold said quietly. "Different vehicles, but they all drive the same way. Slow, careful, like they're looking for something." Margaret's pulse quickened. "How long do you think those documents were buried? What if someone's been watching, waiting for us to find them?" The SUV stopped at the gate, engine idling. Neither of them could see the driver through the dark glass, but Margaret felt exposed, as if invisible eyes were cataloguing every detail of their morning routine. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle moved on, disappearing around the bend toward town. "We need to get these documents somewhere safe," Harold said, already gathering the papers. "If someone's watching us, they might—" Rex's barking cut off abruptly. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. Through the window they could see the dog standing motionless near the fence, his attention fixed on something in the distance. Margaret grabbed the binoculars from the kitchen drawer and focused on the area where Rex stood. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of scrub brush and limestone outcropping. Then movement caught her eye. A figure in dark clothing crouched behind a cluster of mesquite trees about 200 yards from the house, clearly watching their property. "Harold," she whispered, handing him the binoculars. "Southeast corner, behind the mesquites." Harold adjusted the focus and cursed under his breath. "Professional surveillance. Whoever that is knows what they're doing." He lowered the binoculars, his expression grim. "Margaret, I don't think we stumbled onto some decades-old cold case. I think we've walked into something that's very much alive." As if summoned by his words, Margaret's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the answer button. In 30 years of marriage, she'd learned to trust Harold's instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming danger. The phone continued to ring, its sound sharp and insistent in the morning quiet, while outside their window, Rex remained frozen in place, watching their uninvited observer with the patient intensity of a predator. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the ranch road, leaving Margaret and Harold standing in the sudden quiet of their front yard. Kaiser sat at attention beside them, his dark eyes following the retreating vehicle until it vanished around the bend. "We can't stay here," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after what Jenkins told us." Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the manila envelope Sheriff Rawlings had left behind. Inside were photocopies of documents that painted a picture she'd never imagined. Financial records, property transfers, and most damning of all, a letter in her father's handwriting that made her stomach turn. 30 years, she murmured. 30 years we stayed away because we thought we were protecting ourselves from the memories, but we were really protecting ourselves from the truth. Kaiser whined softly and nudged against her leg. The dog had been restless since the sheriff's visit, pacing between the house and the old oak tree where he'd first started digging. It was as if he sensed the weight of what had been unearthed, not just the metal box, but everything that discovery had set in motion. Harold ran a weathered hand through his grey hair. "Your father wasn't the man we thought he was, Maggie, but that doesn't mean we're responsible for what he did. Doesn't it?" The words came out sharper than she intended. All those years, all those people who lost everything because of the water rights scandal, and we inherited the money he made from it. We lived off it, Harold. We bought our house in Austin with blood money. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Margaret felt sweat beading on her forehead, despite the chill that had settled in her bones. The ranch that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to press in around them, heavy with secrets and lies. Kaiser suddenly barked and bolted toward the barn. Margaret and Harold exchanged glances before following, their feet crunching on the dried grass. They found the dog pawing at the base of the barn wall, whimpering with an urgency that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "What is it, boy?" Harold knelt beside the German shepherd, running his hands along the weathered wood where Kaiser was focused. "There's something here. Feels like a loose board." Margaret watched as Harold worked the plank free, revealing a narrow gap behind it. Kaiser immediately stuck his nose into the opening, tail wagging frantically. Harold reached in and his face went pale. "There's another box." This one was smaller than the first, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry despite decades of Texas weather. Margaret's heart hammered as Harold carefully unwrapped it, revealing a simple wooden jewelry box that she recognized immediately. "That belonged to my mother," she breathed. "I thought it was lost in the fire." With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a collection of items that made the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. A stack of photographs, a small tape recorder, and a leather journal bound with a rubber band. The photographs were what made her gasp. Her father, younger than she'd ever seen him, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. They were shaking hands in front of what looked like a government building, both wearing broad smiles that now seemed sinister. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was a protest sign that read, "Save our water." "Oh, God," Margaret whispered, flipping through the images. He documented everything. Why would he keep evidence of his own crimes? Harold picked up the tape recorder with careful hands. It was an old model, the kind their father had used for business dictation. A piece of masking tape on the side bore 2 words written in familiar handwriting. Insurance policy. He was protecting himself, Harold realized. If he ever got caught, he had evidence against his CO conspirators. Margaret opened the journal and began reading aloud from the first entry, March 15th, 1987. Councilman Barrett says the deal is solid. The Martinez family doesn't know what their land is really worth, and by the time they figure it out, the contracts will be signed. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing, but Barrett says it's progress. Development means jobs. She stopped reading, unable to continue. The words swam before her eyes as the full scope of her father's betrayal became clear. It wasn't just corruption. It was the systematic destruction of an entire community. Kaiser moved closer to her, pressing his warm body against her legs as if sensing her distress. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of an approaching vehicle. "Someone's coming," Harold said, shading his eyes against the sun. "Black sedan. That's not Sheriff Rawlings." Margaret quickly gathered the photographs and journal, her hands shaking as she tried to stuff everything back into the box. Whatever her father had been involved in, whoever he'd been working with, it was clear that some secrets were too dangerous to stay buried. The sedan was getting closer, and Margaret had the sinking feeling that their peaceful return to the ranch was about to become something far more dangerous. The sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the dusty road, leaving Margaret and Harold alone with the weight of what they'd just learned. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the porch railing, watching the dust settle in the fading afternoon light. 30 years, she whispered. "We've been living with a lie for 30 years. Harold moved behind her, his presence both comforting and foreign. Everything felt different now. The ranch, their marriage, even the air seemed charged with malevolent possibility. Rex emerged from beneath the porch steps where he'd been hiding since the sheriff's departure, his ears still flattened against his skull. "The question is," Harold said slowly, "what do we do now?" Margaret turned to face him, studying the man she'd shared 3 decades with. Lines etched his face that hadn't been there that morning, aging him in the span of a single day. "You really don't remember anything else? Nothing about that night?" "I've been trying," he said, rubbing his temples. "It's like there's a wall in my mind. I remember being angry, remember shouting, but then—" He gestured helplessly. "Nothing until you were shaking me awake the next morning, telling me we had to leave. 'Cause you told me to pack. You said we were in danger." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You said if we didn't leave immediately, we'd both end up dead." Harold's face went pale. "I said that?" Before Margaret could respond, Rex began barking frantically, his attention focused on the tree line beyond the barn. Both of them froze, listening. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that made every sound seem amplified. "Probably just a coyote," Harold murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness between the trees. Rex's barking intensified, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Margaret felt the hair on her arms rise as a memory surfaced. Rex had barked the same way the night they'd fled, the night everything changed. "Get inside," Harold said, his hand finding the small of her back. "Now." They moved quickly toward the house, Rex trotting alongside them, still alert and agitated. As they reached the front door, Margaret glanced back and saw it, a flash of movement among the oak trees. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Harold," she breathed. "I saw it too." Inside, Harold immediately began checking windows while Margaret tried to calm Rex. The dog refused to settle, pacing between the front door and the kitchen, whining low in his throat. "Maybe we should call the sheriff back," Margaret said. "And tell him what? That we saw shadows in the woods?" Harold shook his head. "Besides, what if whoever's out there isn't here about what we just discovered? What if they're here about what happened 30 years ago?" The possibility hung between them like a physical presence. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. Who else knew we were coming back? Real estate agent? The utility companies? Harold paused. And whoever's been keeping an eye on this place all these years, someone's been maintaining it, Margaret. The roof, the plumbing, even the electrical system. None of it should be working this well after 3 decades of abandonment. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "You think someone's been living here? Or watching it? Waiting for us to come back?" Rex suddenly went silent, his ears perked forward. In the distance they heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching. Margaret felt her heart rate spike as headlights swept across the windows. But instead of stopping at the house, the vehicle continued past, its engine fading into the night. "Just someone driving by," Harold said, but Margaret noticed he didn't move away from the window. "Or someone who wanted to confirm we were here." They spent the next hour in tense silence, taking turns watching the windows and jumping at every sound. Margaret found herself studying Harold's profile in the lamplight, searching for clues to the man he'd been 30 years ago. Had she ever really known him? Had their entire marriage been built on the foundation of that one terrible night? "We should leave," she said finally. "Pack up and go back to Dallas. Pretend we never came here." Harold was quiet for a long moment. "We can't run forever, Margaret. Whatever happened here, whatever I did, it's part of us now. Rex found those bones for a reason. Or maybe he found them to warn us away." "No." Harold's voice was firm. "If we leave now, we'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. I need to remember what happened that night, and you need to remember why you helped me cover it up." Margaret stared at him. "What makes you think I helped you?" "Because," Harold said quietly, "you knew exactly where to find the shovel." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made the Texas landscape shimmer like broken glass. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold load the last of the evidence boxes into their truck. Her hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms but doing nothing to chase away the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Kaiser lay sprawled on the porch, his massive frame relaxed for the first time in days. The German shepherd's work was done. What he had unearthed would either save them or destroy them completely. "Ready?" Harold's voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, keys jangling in his weathered hand. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent poring over documents that painted their father as a monster. Margaret nodded, though ready felt like a foreign concept. How could anyone be ready to hand over evidence that their own father had been involved in a murder cover-up that spanned 3 decades? How could they be prepared to watch their family name crumble to dust? The drive to town stretched endlessly before them. Margaret found herself studying every familiar landmark, the bent fence post where cattle had once gathered, the old oak where she'd carved her initials as a teenager, the rusted mailbox that still bore their family name in faded letters. Soon, that name might mean something entirely different to the people of Cedar Ridge. "We could still burn it all," Harold said quietly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Drive to the county line, find a safe place, and torch every last document. No one would ever know." Margaret turned to study her brother's profile. Lines of exhaustion and worry had aged him years in just days. "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried. Maybe Dad had good reasons for what he did." "Good reasons for helping cover up a murder?" Margaret's voice rose. "For letting an innocent family suffer for 30 years, wondering what happened to their son?" Harold flinched but didn't respond. They both knew she was right, but knowing and accepting were 2 different beasts entirely. The Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Station appeared around the next bend, its brick facade looking more imposing than Margaret remembered from their childhood. Sheriff Collins would be waiting inside, probably with federal agents and district attorneys and all manner of officials ready to dissect their father's crimes with clinical precision. Harold pulled into the parking lot but didn't immediately cut the engine. They sat in silence, watching people go about their normal morning routines, a woman walking her dog, a man checking his mail, children waiting for the school bus. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of devastating family secrets. "Remember when we used to bring Dad lunch here?" Margaret whispered. "He'd always save half his sandwich to share with us, even when money was tight. He taught me to tie my shoes in that office," Harold added. His voice thick with emotion, said a man's character showed in how he took care of the small things. Margaret laughed bitterly. Funny how he forgot that lesson when it came to the big things. Harold finally turned off the engine. The silence felt deafening after hours of road noise and their own circular arguments. In the bed of the truck, 3 cardboard boxes held the power to rewrite history, not just for their family, but for the Torres family who had spent decades grieving without answers. "Maria Torres deserves the truth," Margaret said, voicing what they both knew. Her son was 22 years old. He had a whole life ahead of him. Harold's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I know. God help me, I know you're right." They climbed out of the truck together, each taking a box. The evidence felt heavier than it should have, not just the physical weight of paper and photographs, but the crushing burden of truth itself. Margaret's legs felt unsteady as they approached the station doors. Sheriff Collins appeared before they could knock, his face grave but not unkind. He'd known their family for years, had probably looked up to their father as a young deputy. This couldn't be easy for him either. "Margaret." "Harold." He nodded respectfully. "I want you to know that whatever happens here today, it takes courage to do what you're doing." Margaret wanted to feel noble, but all she felt was hollow. Courage implied choice, and she'd learned over the past week that some choices made themselves. Once you knew the truth, once you'd stared evil in the face and recognized it as someone you loved, there was really only one path forward. "Is she here?" Margaret asked. "Mrs. Torres?" Sheriff Collins nodded. "She flew in from San Antonio this morning. She's been waiting 30 years for this day." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself for what came next. When she opened them, Harold was watching her with something that might have been pride. Together, they stepped across the threshold into whatever remained of their future. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly under fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. Margaret's footsteps echoed against the linoleum as she hurried toward the ICU, her heart hammering against her ribs. Harold had collapsed just as Sheriff Dawson's patrol car pulled into their driveway, his face draining of all color when he saw the familiar badge through the window. Now he lay unconscious, machines beeping steadily around his still form. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, had mentioned stress and exhaustion, but Margaret knew better. This wasn't about their physical ordeal in the storm cellar or even the dehydration. This was about 30 years of carrying a secret that had finally grown too heavy. "Mrs. Chen?" Sheriff Dawson appeared in the doorway, his hat tucked under his arm. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who'd delivered bad news too many times. "How's he doing?" "Stable." Margaret didn't take her eyes off Harold's pale face. "What did you find out there?" Dawson stepped into the room, his boots squeaking softly on the floor. "Forensics team still working, but preliminary examination suggests the remains are definitely from the 1990s. Male, early 30s, multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma." Margaret's hands tightened around the plastic chair arms. Through the window, dawn was breaking over the Texas landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of better times. "There's something else," Dawson continued, his voice gentler now. "We found personal effects. A wallet, mostly deteriorated, but we managed to recover a driver's license. Name was Thomas Kellerman." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd hoped somehow that the bones would belong to a stranger, someone whose death could be explained away by accident or natural causes. But Tommy Kellerman, she remembered him now, young, eager, with dreams of making it big in oil speculation. He'd been sniffing around their property that summer, convinced there were untapped reserves beneath their land. "Did you know him?" Dawson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Before Margaret could respond, Harold's eyes fluttered open. His gaze found hers immediately, and she saw the question there, the desperate hope that this had all been a nightmare. "Tommy Kellerman," she said quietly. Harold's face crumpled. "Oh, God!" Dawson moved closer to the bed. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about Mr. Kellerman. When did you last see him?" "July," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible above the machine sounds. "July 15th, 1993. What happened that night, Harold?" Margaret found herself asking the question she'd been avoiding for 3 decades. Harold closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. He wouldn't leave. Kept saying he knew there was oil, that he had geological surveys to prove it, said he was going to file claims, get court orders. Harold's breathing grew labored. "I told him to get off our property, but he laughed, said we were just small-time ranchers who didn't understand what we were sitting on." Sheriff Dawson pulled out a notebook. "What time was this?" "Late, past midnight. Margaret was in Austin visiting her sister." Harold's eyes opened, finding Margaret's face again. He was drunk, belligerent. Started shoving me, saying he wasn't leaving until I signed some kind of partnership agreement. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. "Harold, what did you do?" I pushed him back. Hard. He stumbled, fell against the old water trough, the metal one with the sharp edges. Harold's voice broke. There was so much blood. I checked his pulse, tried to help him, but he was gone. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady rhythm of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing in other rooms. "Why didn't you call the police?" Dawson asked. Harold let out a bitter laugh. "You think anyone would have believed me?" Tommy was connected. His uncle was a state senator. I was just a rancher with a history of arguments over property rights. And Margaret, he looked at his wife with anguished eyes. She was finally happy. We'd just started talking about having children, about building a real life together. I couldn't destroy that. Margaret reached for his hand, feeling how fragile his fingers had become. "So you buried him?" "Used the backhoe to dig deep, then built the storm cellar over the spot. Figured no one would ever think to look there." Harold squeezed her fingers weakly. "I told myself I was protecting us, protecting our future. But every day since I've carried him with me. Every single day." Outside the window, the Texas sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. Margaret watched dust motes dance in the golden light and wondered how many other secrets lay buried in the vast expanse of land that had once been theirs. Some discoveries, she realized, didn't just change your future. They rewrote your past entirely. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold load the last of their evidence into the truck bed. 3 cardboard boxes containing 30 years of buried truth, each one feeling heavier than the last time she'd lifted them. Kaiser lay beneath the old oak tree, his intelligent eyes tracking their every movement as if he understood the gravity of what they were about to do. "You sure about this?" Harold asked, securing the tarp over the boxes. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd aged a decade in the past week. Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. "Detective Morrison needs to see everything. We can't keep running from what happened here." The drive into town felt endless, each mile marker a countdown to the moment their carefully constructed life would crumble. They'd spent 3 decades believing Harold's brother had simply vanished, that David's gambling debts and shady associates had finally caught up with him. They'd mourned him, built their new life on the foundation of his absence, never knowing his body lay buried beneath their own property. But the evidence Kaiser had uncovered told a different story entirely. David hadn't fled his debts. He'd been murdered, and the killer had been someone with intimate knowledge of the ranch, someone who knew exactly where to hide a body. The police station's parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived. Margaret's legs felt unsteady as she stepped from the truck, the Texas heat already pressing down despite the early hour. Harold moved with mechanical precision, unloading the boxes while she gathered the manila folders containing photocopies of everything they'd found. Detective Morrison was younger than Margaret had expected, with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that suggested competence. She listened without interruption as Harold explained their discovery, her expression growing increasingly grave as he described the location of the remains, the personal effects, and most damning of all, the documents they'd found hidden in David's old room. "These letters," Morrison said, spreading the yellowed pages across her desk, "they indicate your brother-in-law was planning to expose someone's illegal activities." Harold nodded grimly. David was reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He'd figured out that someone was using our ranch as a transit point for drug smuggling. The letters suggest he was going to the FBI. Margaret watched the detective's face as she read David's final correspondence, dated just days before his disappearance. The handwriting was David's, but the tone was unlike anything they'd ever seen from him. Serious, frightened, determined to do the right thing despite the obvious danger. "He mentions a business partner of yours," Morrison noted, looking up at Harold. "Someone named Carlos Mendez?" The name hit Harold like a physical blow. Margaret reached for his hand, feeling the tremor that ran through his fingers. Carlos had been their neighbor, their friend, the man who'd helped them search for David when he'd first gone missing. He'd comforted them in their grief, had even offered to buy the ranch when they'd decided to leave Texas behind. "Carlos was like family," Harold whispered. "We trusted him completely. According to these documents, your brother-in-law discovered that Mendez was using your property to move drugs across the border. David had photographs, transaction records, even recorded conversations. Morrison's voice was gentle but relentless. It appears he was building a substantial case." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. All those years of wondering, of guilt over their failure to find David, of believing they'd somehow failed him as family. The truth was far worse than anything they'd imagined. "There's something else," Morrison continued, pulling out an evidence bag containing a tarnished silver watch. "We found this with the remains. It's engraved." Harold's face went white as he read the inscription, "To Carlos, with gratitude for your partnership. H.S." "I gave him that watch," Harold said, his voice barely audible, "for his birthday the year before David disappeared. I thought it would cement our business relationship." The irony was devastating. Harold's gift had ended up buried with his brother's body, either lost during the struggle or deliberately placed there by a killer who understood the cruel poetry of the gesture. Morrison closed the evidence bag carefully. "We'll need full statements from both of you, and we'll want to examine the burial site immediately. After 30 years, building a case will be challenging, but this evidence gives us a strong foundation." As they walked back to their truck, Margaret noticed Harold's shoulders were straighter than they'd been in days. The truth was terrible, but it was still the truth. They finally knew what had happened to David, and more importantly, they could ensure his killer faced justice. Kaiser was waiting when they returned to the ranch, his tail wagging as if he understood they'd taken the first step toward setting things right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas ranch as Margaret stood on the porch, watching Harold load the last of their belongings into the truck. 3 weeks had passed since Kaiser had made his grisly discovery in the old well, 3 weeks since their world had been turned upside down by bones and truth. Detective Rivera's final report lay folded in Margaret's jacket pocket. The remains had been identified through dental records as Tommy Hutchinson, the drifter who'd worked their ranch in the summer of 1993. The same summer Harold's father had grown increasingly paranoid and violent, the same summer that had driven them to flee this place in the first place. "You sure about this?" Harold asked, hefting another box into the truck bed. His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, but also something else, relief perhaps. Margaret nodded, her fingers finding Kaiser's head as the German shepherd pressed against her legs. "We can't stay here, not after everything." The investigation had cleared them of any wrongdoing, but the questions it raised about Harold's father cut deep. Samuel Morrison had been a hard man, everyone knew that, but the possibility that he'd killed Tommy Hutchinson and hidden the body had shattered Harold's few remaining illusions about his childhood home. "Mrs. Morrison?" They turned to see a familiar figure approaching, Elena Vasquez, the young woman whose grandfather had once worked their land. She carried a small wooden box in her hands. "I wanted to return this before you left," Elena said, offering the box to Margaret. "My grandfather kept it all these years. He said your father-in-law gave it to him the night before you folks disappeared." Harold's face went pale as Margaret opened the box. Inside lay a tarnished silver watch and a folded piece of paper. Harold recognized the watch immediately. It had been Tommy's, the one thing of value the drifter had owned. With trembling fingers, Margaret unfolded the paper. Samuel Morrison's angular handwriting filled the page. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally come out. Tommy Hutchinson tried to assault my daughter-in-law. I found him in the house that night, found Margaret unconscious on the kitchen floor. I did what any man would do to protect his family. I'm not sorry for killing him, but I'm sorry Harold and Margaret had to pay the price. The boy never knew. I made sure of that." Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank onto the porch steps. Harold knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as they both processed the words. "I don't remember," Margaret whispered. "I don't remember any of it." "Head trauma can cause memory loss," Elena said gently. "My grandmother was a curandera. She saw things like this before." Harold's voice was thick with emotion. "All these years I thought Dad drove us away with his anger. I never knew he was trying to protect us." Kaiser whined softly, sensing the tension. Margaret buried her face in his fur, the familiar comfort of his presence anchoring her as memories she'd long suppressed began to surface. Fractured images of that terrible night, the fear, the pain, and then nothing until she'd awakened in the hospital with no memory of what had happened. "There's something else," Elena said. "My grandfather wanted you to know that your father-in-law asked him to look after the place. He said Samuel Morrison wasn't a bad man, just a man who made an impossible choice." Margaret looked up at the ranch house, seeing it now through different eyes. The isolation that had once felt oppressive now seemed protective. The silence that had haunted them carried the weight of sacrifice. "What do we do now?" Harold asked. Margaret stood slowly, her decision crystallizing. "We sell it, but not to developers." She turned to Elena. "Your family worked this land for generations. It should belong to people who understand what it means." Elena's eyes widened. "We could never afford—" "You can afford what we're asking," Margaret interrupted. $1, and a promise to take care of Kaiser when we can't anymore." As if understanding, Kaiser padded over to Elena and sat at her feet, his tail wagging slowly. The transfer of ownership took place the following week in the dusty office of a local attorney. Margaret signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling lighter with each signature. They would return to San Antonio with their secrets finally laid to rest, their past no longer a burden, but a story of love and protection that transcended the grave. On their final drive down the long dirt road, Margaret rolled down the window and let the Texas wind whip through her hair. Behind them, Kaiser watched from Elena's arms, his keen eyes alert and knowing. He had brought them the truth, and in doing so, had given them the freedom to finally leave it behind. The ranch disappeared in the dust and distance, but the peace it had ultimately provided would travel with them always.